San Andreas. And I finished my internship and residency at UC San Francisco in 1996. And then I moved here to San Andreas in 96, which was 22 years ago. And I've been working as a family practice doctor in private practice with Adventist Health, now with Dignity Health. So I've kind of moved around my practice setting, but I've still been doing basically the same things. And I've learned some things during that time that I think could be helpful to a senior audience about how to stay healthy, about how to prevent illness, prevent disease, and kind of what the difference is between disease and health. And so that was something that took me a while to figure out. Because when I finished my medical training, we were taught pretty well how to diagnose disease and how to treat disease, but we really didn't learn much about health. And those are two kind of separate concepts, the concept of health and the concept of disease. And so that's something that took me a while to figure out. And I think there's good ways to illustrate that. And ancient people had good ideas about some things and some weird ideas about things. Like when it came to health, ancient people thought that there were, humors that, would affect our health, or, God would, create a plague. We didn't know about the germ theory of illness, and we thought maybe we had done sins or were smited by God and things like that. So ancient people had some weird ideas about health, but ancient people also had some good ideas about the physical world, about matter. So there were forces that were affecting matter. There was the force of gravity, which made things go down to the earth, and there was the force of levity. Levity would make things levitate as opposed to gravitate. So levity was a force that made objects rise away from the center of the earth. And those two forces would have to be in balance. Like a bird flying in the air was having the forces of gravity and levity, in balance with one another. And that's what made objects, spaced out in 3 dimensions in the physical world. And so I like to think of health and longevity for seniors as kind of the same thing. So we can live longer and we can improve our longevity by addressing both of the factors of disease, which wants to pull us down, right, into the ground, into the grave, right, and health, which is a positive influence and wants to lift us up and keep us out of the ground, right? So things that we can do that will enhance our level of health is going to be good, and things that we can do to reduce our burden of disease or our risk of disease is going to be good. So focusing on both of those things, and they're two different things. It took me a while to figure that out. So things that we can do to enhance both of those factors are going to contribute to our health and longevity as we age. So examples of each one of those now. When it comes to preventing disease, I think one of the most effective ways that we've figured out in the last few generations is through immunization and vaccinations. So that's been shown to significantly reduce disease. If you look at a list of top 10 causes of death, right? 100 years ago, the top 10 causes of death would look really different than today's top 10 causes of death. Let's just take the top 3. So there's heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Those are today's modern top 3 causes of death. Actually, COVID-19 has moved into number 3. So we passed the milestone recently with 1 million deaths due to COVID-19 infection in just America, just the United States, since this pandemic started. So the top 3 causes of death today are heart disease, cancer, and COVID-19, as opposed to stroke and cerebrovascular disease. So if you looked 100 years ago, the causes of death would be, tuberculosis, pneumonia, meningitis, a lot of those infectious diseases. And immunizations have been one of the primary ways that we've reduced the burden of infectious diseases and have now made chronic diseases rise up to be the main causes of death. So I would like to stress to the senior population the importance of immunizations. We've talked a lot about COVID-19 vaccine and about how important that is and how effective that is in reducing the risk of severe disease from COVID. I've had patients that tell me, no, I don't want to get the vaccine because I heard you can still get COVID if you get the vaccine. Well, that's true. But if you do get COVID and you're vaccinated, the risk of severe disease is much less. That's defined as needing to be in the hospital or dying from COVID. So COVID-19 vaccination is a really huge thing that people can do to reduce their risk of disease. Also, other immunizations that we take for granted, pneumonia vaccine, influenza vaccine, your annual flu shot, other types of vaccines are polio, measles, hepatitis. So there's a variety of immunizations, and they all have significantly reduced the risk of disease and improved our longevity in the last few generations. So that's something that people can do to reduce their risk of disease, right, of getting pulled down into the ground. And then things that people can do to increase their health in general terms are sometimes not as sexy or not as scientific, but they're routine things that people sometimes take for granted. Like, for example, evidence-based ways that people can improve their health are eating well, diet. That's something that we all have ideas about, but sometimes people don't really know, well, what should I be eating? What's a healthy diet, right? And I don't know that there's one answer for that, but there's a person, his name is Michael Pollard, and he's a food writer, and he wrote a book that has a very simple 7-word title, and I think his book is really helpful for people if they want to read it. It's called Eat Food, Not Too Much, Mostly Plants. So that's the title of this book. And those 7 words, I think, encompass, pretty much everything that people need to know when it comes to eating, right? So when he says eat food, what he means by that is eat real food, natural foods, right? Foods that your grandmother would think of as foods, things that are not processed, things that don't, come from the middle of the supermarket. Right? When people go to the supermarket, stay away from the middle of the supermarket, right? Where all the processed stuff is. You've got the produce area, you've got breads, you've got meat, then you got the middle. So people should kind of stay away from the middle. When it comes to foods also, it's important to look at the labels and try to pick foods that have less than 5 ingredients in them. So that's just another good tip that Michael Pollard talks about, right? Is trying to find things that, foods that contain less than 5 ingredients. Also, he talks about looking for foods staying away from foods that don't rot. So if you have natural foods without preservatives, those foods will not keep for long periods of time. If you see foods that last forever, those are foods that people should probably try to avoid, right? Like a Twinkie or something like that, right? That'll probably last like 20 years. And so, that's something that people can avoid. It's important that he says, Michael Pollard says that it's important to eat meals together, have it be a social activity, trying to avoid eating alone, eating in your car, eating between meals, right? Those kind of things. So having food be social, eating together at meal times, and trying to avoid eating in between meals, isolated, on the go, that kind of thing. So I think if people are interested in, ways that they can improve their health, diet is probably the #1 thing that people can do. Avoiding alcohol. I used to tell patients, well, a small amount of alcohol is probably okay, right? I think a glass of wine, red wine once a day might have tannins or might have other ingredients in it that might actually help you live a little bit longer. I think some new research probably says that's not the case. So even small amounts of alcohol probably aren't good for us or make us live longer. It's a matter of degrees, right? The more you drink, the more detrimental effect it can have on you. And there's probably, an emotional, component to having, a glass of wine or something, with friends or family that's, mentally good for us. But alcohol has probably been shown to not really be good for us on a long-term basis, even in small or moderate amounts like we used to think. So those are just some things, some thoughts I had that I thought might be good to, for senior audiences, of things that they can do to both improve their level of health and reduce their risk of disease, right? And so that balance, I think, is important for people to understand and keep in mind when they're, thinking about ways they can increase and improve their longevity. And we all reach a point in life where we're kind of closer to the end of our lives than we are to the beginning of our life. And that's a time where people, I think, start to kind of reflect on what can I do to improve my health and live longer. So those are, I think, are some tools that people can incorporate into that goal in the long run. So any questions on anyone's part here? I mean, it doesn't even have to be about anything that I talked about, just questions about anything in general, about medicine or health, anything.
I try to encourage our clients to make sure that they do contact their doctor and make appointments to get checked regularly, and whether that's blood work or, just to keep them in touch with their doctor medical. Obviously, we're a non-medical agency, so we certainly don't want to be their go-to, our clients going to us for, questions or concerns that they have. I always want to, how often do you feel senior community should be seeing their doctor? If that's,
That's a good question. I think it depends what their level of health is and if they have certain health problems that they're having managed. If patients have, heart disease, diabetes, they're on multiple medications, I encourage those patients to see me 4 times a year or every 3 months. Okay. If patients are relatively healthy and, don't take a lot of medications, once a year, I think, would be good. Okay. So anywhere for people over 65, once a year for those who don't have a lot going on, all the way to every 3 months for people that I'm monitoring things more closely with. Okay. So, and then, anywhere in between. Sometimes I'll tell a person, look, I want to see you back in 6 months, and, that person might have a medium amount of stuff going on. So those are kind of the spectrums between the intervals that we like to see patients in the office for routine care.
Very good.
Do you have any suggestions for people who are, I know a lot of seniors are on limited incomes and don't have a lot of money even, food is one of the few things that one of the things that they actually cut back on a lot of times when they don't have a lot of money. And I know I get comments from some clients and stuff saying that, fruits and vegetables are so expensive, and stuff. Is there any suggestions on what they can do to try to eat better, or when they're on
with the economics of food, sometimes it is true that foods that are higher in calories and more processed sometimes are less expensive. Fast food, eating at McDonald's or Taco Bell is probably cheaper than if you were to go out and buy all of those ingredients yourself and make that food at home, right? So that's a difficult force to compete with. When you're telling people to eat in certain ways, it might be a little bit more costly to eat in those ways than it is to choose foods that are higher in calories and higher in salt and fat and sugar and that kind of thing. So part of that is because we haven't really prioritized as a nation funding for those for those types of foods. We give a lot of incentives to industry to make processed foods, and maybe not so much for the growing of whole foods. There are farmers markets, in the area that people can go to, and that can be a source of locally sourced fresh fruits and vegetables, and growing, our own food. is still an option if people physically have the ability to do that, and they have the space and they have the property and that kind of thing. Growing one's own food is still a good source of accessing inexpensive fruits and vegetables as well. But that's a tough one, because the economics of our food system, sometimes favors more processed foods over whole, real foods. But it's the whole and real foods that are ones that are going to improve our health.
And I find as people get older too and everything, is that they choose to either eat the salty foods or the foods higher in sugar, because they start losing like their tastes and things, and those are the things that will bring out some kind of taste buds for them and everything, and they do choose to go for the sugar or the salt.
Right, and those foods are more intense, and those foods are designed, to be able to, trigger, those types of responses in our brains.
Yeah.
So, again, choosing those more natural and whole foods is going to be better in the long run for people. But I understand that sometimes if people are losing maybe some of their taste, that foods that are more, aggressive and stimulating those taste buds might be ones that people are, gravitate towards.
I know my own father, he was in a facility and he was saying the water wasn't tasting right. I'm like, what do you mean the water's not tasting right? So we bought several different brands of water. Aquafina, we bought different, and every one of them he kept saying, it doesn't taste right. It's like, but it's water. But,
yeah. And sometimes not only just the aging process, but medications that we put patients on can sometimes cause dryness of the mouth, affect taste, that kind of thing. And one of the things that I recommend that people do as they age is to try to avoid salts as much as they can. Sodium, which is the main component of salt is sodium chloride. So sodium can cause fluid retention. And with fluid retention, it elevates the blood pressure. It can cause swelling in the legs and feet. If people have certain health conditions like something called congestive heart failure, where the heart's starting to weaken a little bit, too much salt in their diet causing fluid retention can cause breathing difficulty, that kind of thing. So as a general rule, I try to tell patients to try to limit sodium as much as they can. You can't have zero sodium, but 2,000 milligrams is a good marker for sodium. So looking at labels of things. So first I'll tell people, get rid of the salt shaker, right? So that's number one. That's low-hanging fruit as far as getting rid of salt in your diet. And then the second thing to do is to look at labels of stuff. So if you look at labels and it says 400 milligrams and this one says 1,600 milligrams, it's like, well, shoot, that's almost what he said I should have in a whole day, right? So I'm going to go for the one that's just 400. And then people can kind of see over the course of a day if they're getting close to that 2,000 milligram marker, which has been shown to, be the cutoff point above which people start to run into problems. So, and the average American gets about 4,000 milligrams a day of sodium. So 2,000 milligrams is a good guide, because that's about half of what the average person gets in a day. So salt is another thing that, we recommend people try to avoid as much as they can. Good.
So yeah, big deal. I can't imagine telling a senior, no more salt. Especially my dad, I should say that.
Yeah, reduce it. Yeah, I tell them reduce. They say, well, you can't get zero salt. I said, no, you're right, you can't get zero, but just try to get less than 2,000.
So my comment would be that I've noticed, I went on the South Beach diet quite a few years ago, and the unexpected thing was, by cutting out all those carbs, my arthritis was so much better.
So the inflammation.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
it really made a difference.
Yeah, some foods can have pro-inflammatory effects in the body. Processed foods, gluten, that kind of thing, those can cause inflammation. And so you're probably reducing inflammation through your diet. South Beach diet is kind of like a low-carb diet.
Correct.
Yeah, so typically we would say to get a diet, like if you look at the USDA food pyramid and things like that, right? It's mainly, carbohydrates, protein, and little bits of fat, right? So that thinking is carbohydrates can maybe contribute to weight, diabetes, all kinds of stuff. So diets like South Beach, there's one called The Zone by a guy named Barry Sears. These diets, you kind of reduce the amount of carbohydrates and you increase the amount of proteins a little bit, like 40, 30, 30, like 40% carbohydrates, 30% protein, 30% fat, which is a little bit different than the USDA food pyramid, you know, where the base of it is carbohydrates, basically.
Correct.
So, you know, that type of diet, like a South Beach or a Zone or, you know, those kind of diets, you know, they can be good for weight loss. They can be good for people who are trying to control their blood sugar. You know, that there's different reasons for that. I like a Mediterranean diet, I think is good, because a Mediterranean diet is pretty low in fat. It has healthy fats like olive oil and, you know, like low-fat cheese like feta, you know, that kind of thing. So a Mediterranean diet is also...
I love
Avocado.
But avocado's a good fat.
Yeah, I know, that's what
Yeah,
it's like.
yeah,
That's a good
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, the bad types of fats tend to come more from, you know, like animal products, like red meat, you know, fats that you get from animal products where they tend to be saturated fats and they're solid at room temperature, as opposed to healthier fats like olive oil and you know, natural oils, which are going to be liquid at room temperature. Those are more unsaturated fats.
What about protein needs of seniors? I remember I read somewhere that seniors require less protein and that sometimes you can actually get too much protein with like a meal that's based on meat.
Yeah,
as opposed
right.
to having it based on vegetables with the meat being the side portion. Is that in any way
Yeah, I mean,
accurate?
we don't need that much protein. Even those diets like a South Beach diet or an Atkins diet, right? Those are diets that are low in carbohydrates and higher in proteins. They're still not going to be much above 40% protein, you know, 30, 40% protein. And that's pretty much all we need. If we get a diet that's like really high in protein, that's harder to metabolize, that stresses the kidneys. You know, there's probably not, it's not healthy to have a really high protein diet. You know, it sometimes with aging, there can be some malnutrition in seniors. And so they can have weight loss. I mean, it's good to not be overweight as we age. If we go over to the nursing home and we walk around and people are in their 80s and 90s and close to 100, there's not going to be a lot of people over there who are heavy, right, who are overweight. They get kind of selected out, right, as you age. But then weight loss can be a problem in seniors sometimes. And so getting enough protein is going to be important for them. Enough, not too much. Like if you have an Ensure, you know, Ensure and Resource and Boost, those nutritional supplements, those are going to be about 30, 40% protein. So those, if someone's losing weight, you know, if grandma's losing weight, we'll say, you know, take an Ensure once a day. And so those are kind of a good source of dietary supplement that has protein, but not too much, about 30, 40%.
Yeah.
And that can help prevent muscle loss and, you know, metabolism of our lean body stores.
I know the other thing I notice for myself as I've gotten older, that I eat really well most of the time, but then I go through periods of time where I go, I need my macaroni and cheese and my comfort food, you know, I mean, there's no middle ground. It's either I'm eating really healthy and then all of a sudden it's an emotional thing. I just feel, I don't know what, and I gotta have.
Eating, food and eating is complicated. So people eat for more reasons than just being hungry.
Exactly.
Right? We eat because it can change the way we feel. It's a social activity. We you know, like if we're going to celebrate, let's go out to dinner. Right? Let's eat. We're going to celebrate, right? Or if we're depressed or we're feeling stressed, you know, comfort foods, you know, can, you know, make us feel better, changes our mood and change the way we feel. So yeah, eating's complicated. So people eat for more reasons than just, well, I need to eat because I need to sustain my body so I don't die, right? I mean, you eat for more complicated reasons than just that. So that's a pretty good example about, comfort foods, and sometimes you're drawn towards, mashed potatoes and gravy or something,
Yeah, and I think that's a combination of taking us back to our childhood, because we ate more like that.
Yeah.
The way people eat has changed since
Yeah,
I was a child.
Yeah, there's cultural,
Yeah.
all kinds of cultural, implications around eating. When I was growing up, it was like you ate like a man, right? You're going to eat like a man. You can eat salads, those are for wimps, that kind of thing. A man eats a steak, right? So, there's where did we get that from, Men eat steak and potatoes, and how is food, tied up in that? And then when you ate a lot, it'd be, wow, look at Dean, he really ate a lot, he's really growing up, he ate a lot of food and got positive reinforcement for eating lots of food.
Right, so true. He went for that secretly. Look at him go.
Yeah, wow,
He's
that's
going.
great. Yeah.
And then there's the other side of that coin. I think we probably all got raised with, finish everything on your plate.
Yeah.
Now I'm hearing, eat what you need, don't overeat.
Yeah.
It's-
In fact, the guy who I talked about, Michael Pollack, the guy who wrote that book about eat food, not too much, mostly plants, he talks about leaving the table hungry a little bit. Like, be hungry a little bit. That's okay. Sometimes people get sort of afraid if they're hungry. It causes a little bit of anxiety or stress. Oh, I'm hungry, I'm not full. Like when I'm eating, I'm not going to be done eating until I'm full. He talks about, no, be hungry a little bit when you leave the table. That's okay.
Well, what I found is that if I do focus on not overeating, that even though I'm psychologically, sometimes I don't feel like I ate enough, but within 15 minutes or so, I realize I certainly did eat enough, because I'm not hungry. It just takes a little time for the...
There's a little time for that to kick in.
Exactly.
That satiety, that feeling that you've eaten enough.
Exactly.
Sometimes has to be a little bit of a delay.
Before, when I had joined Weight Watchers before and lost a lot of weight, I used to, before that, I'd eat till I was stuffed and I'd be like, I feel horrible. And I learned to eat till I was satisfied, and I could tell when every once in a while I did overeat just a little bit, and I would be like, I don't like feeling this way. And so I made sure that, okay, I would eat till, okay, I feel satisfied. So I wasn't hungry or, over full, and it was just a really nice feeling to know that it's like, okay, I'm satisfied, I'm not.
Yeah, and we've all had food that tastes really good, and it's like, I'm not hungry still, but this just tastes so good, I'm going to have to keep eating it, So I'm trying to avoid that as well.
Like when I'd eat dinner or something and I'd be so stuffed, I was like, I can't eat another bite. Somebody mentioned dessert. Oh yeah, I'm ready for dessert. And I'm like,
Yeah, and portions or something too, that people have to be conscious of. My brother would say, hey, let's go to this restaurant. The restaurant's called Claim Jumper. It's like a chain of these restaurants, like Applebee's or Denny's or whatever. It's called Claim Jumper. He loves this place because they give you like really huge portions. That's their gimmick, is that you get really like huge portions. So that place is great. You get huge portions there. Well, that's not like the definition of like whether it's the food's good. I mean, how does it taste? So the portions, and we would, I'd take my kids out and we would stop and get some ice cream, right? And they have these ice cream places where you get this cup that's like this big, it must be like 3,000 calories, of ice cream in this cup. And if you ask for a taste, they'll give it to you for free, right? You can say, can I have a taste of that, or maybe a taste of that? And they give you just like a little spoon. And I think, okay, that's probably enough. Just a little taste is probably enough,
Yeah.
as opposed to this big tub, The guy who runs the French Laundry restaurant in Yountville, Thomas Keller, right? That French Laundry restaurant is where Gavin Newsom went without a mask and he got in trouble. Right? Remember that? Like during the pandemic? That was the French Laundry. So the chef there, his name is Thomas Keller. He's like one of these celebrity chefs. And he has a theory about food, that food it tastes the best and it's the most intense right when you taste it for the first time, and then it drops off.
That's what they used to say at Weight Watchers too.
So what he does is he has lots of courses of very small things.
Nice.
So if you go to dinner there, it's like 8 or 10 like courses, right? You think, oh my God, 10 courses, how can a person eat that? But then they bring in this big plate that's got this little tiny thing on it, and it's like really delicately made and looks beautiful, and but it's a little tiny thing. And so you eat that, and oh, that was good. And then they bring you something different, right? So he says that it tastes best to do it that way because you're maintaining that intensity of the first time that you're tasting something. So have lots of things that you only get very small amounts of, and that way you'll maintain like the specialness of how it tastes. So when you have this big tub of ice cream, you know what I mean? It diminishes like how good it is, as you eat it. And I'm looking around, and that's kind of what everybody's getting. So I don't know. Just
Makes a lot of sense.
it's a good theory of it's like what would you call it? Like a tasting menu, right? Where you only have like small amounts of like several different things. So that's good. I like to do that.
Definitely. Make it a 3-bite rule.
There you
Yeah.
go.
It's going to be a big bite though. The donut.
10 different courses of Big Bite.
There you go. I have a burning question though. You've taken my alcohol away. Can I keep my dark chocolate? Is my
so
dark
funny.
chocolate still good for me?
Yeah,
Salt is off the table.
that probably is okay. Small amount.
That's so funny,
Well, it's like the egg thing, First eggs were good, then they were bad, now they're good again.
Yeah, well, eggs are good. I mean, if you think about an egg, it's it's got everything that a chick needs, to develop. So it's a very whole and complete food item, an egg.
It is.
But eggs have a lot of cholesterol. So if people have high cholesterol, or they have heart disease, or they've had a stroke, what's called cerebrovascular disease, they have to be on a low cholesterol diet. So eggs are bad for certain people. So usually we'll say eggs 3 times a week. Doc, can I eat eggs? Are eggs cool? I say eggs are okay, but 3 times a week.
Wow.
One egg though.
Yeah,
Well, you can do an egg and an egg white with it.
Yeah, well, the yolk is where the cholesterol is concentrated, so egg whites are, you can have as many egg whites
Right.
as you want.
That's what they taught in Weight Watchers. You could do an egg and an egg white with it
Oh, wow.
to give it a little bit more.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, that is a good idea.
That is a good idea. I have a question completely off this topic. I am curious about vascular dementia. So my understanding is vascular dementia means you're not getting enough blood to your brain, and that's what's causing the dementia. Is that a reversible dementia in some cases?
Well, dementia is a general term, right? It's when you have that loss of memory and cognitive functioning and that kind of thing. So dementia is sort of like an umbrella term. And underneath that, there's different causes and different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's dementia is the most common. Alzheimer's disease, right? Or sometimes, in fact, Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, so much that people will sometimes use those terms interchangeably. right? Alzheimer's and dementia,
Sure.
right? They're interchangeable, but they're really not, because there's a few other forms of causes of dementia. Vascular dementia is one of those. So if people get disease of the arteries that supply the brain with blood, they can sometimes have small strokes, or they can cut off the blood flow to regions of the brain and that kind of thing. So is it reversible? It depends on how much injury's been done to the brain, right? If the brain's damaged, then that might not get better. And it's hard to reverse vascular changes within the skull itself. You can clean up the arteries that supply the brain with blood that come through the neck. Those are called the carotid arteries. If you've got like a 90% blockage in one of those, they'll clean that out and restore the normal blood flow. But it's hard to do that inside the head. You know, you don't really have the technology to do that. So vascular dementia, probably not that reversible, because it already might have damaged the brain. And if there is vascular disease, it's hard to get to if it's deep inside the skull.
Okay.
So, but fortunately, that's a much smaller percentage-wise cause of dementia. Alzheimer's dementia tends to be the main one, and that incidence goes up with aging. And I mean, memory loss in general is a really common thing that people come in to see me for. Once people get into their 70s and 80s, almost everybody is worried that they're losing memory to some degree, right? They say, Doc, you got to check me for Alzheimer's. I'm telling you, I'm losing it. And I say, okay, well, what do you mean? You know, explain that. And they say, well, you know, I mean, I'm forgetting stuff, and I'm not remembering names of people when they introduce themselves. Yeah, and I forget where I put things.
Yep, Diane.
And I'm in the middle of something, and I go into the next room, and I stop, and I say, okay, what the hell did I come in here for? And then I go back to it, and I see that I had something taken apart, and I was looking for a screwdriver. And oh yeah, I needed a screwdriver, and I go back. Or I asked, my wife says, I asked a question, and I'd already asked it like 10 minutes ago, and I forgot that she told me.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. So, you know, people almost universally, you know, once they get into their 80s, let's say, they are worried that they're having memory loss. And so I have to kind of, you know, reassure them that there's natural memory loss, which is from the aging process. It's part of, you know, healthy aging is, you know, there's healthy memory loss as part of the aging process, which is kind of like a slow, gradual thing. And then there's dementia, and that's like a much more rapid form of memory loss. You know, it gets to the point where, you know, it's like we all might forget where we put our keys, but if you have your keys and you forget what they're for, you know, that's a much more profound type of memory loss. So everybody gets a little bit of memory losses with aging, and that's okay. And so people come in and they're worried about that. I'll tell them, well, what you're describing doesn't sound like you're getting Alzheimer's disease, but time kind of will tell us. Say, so make some notes, pay attention to this, let's check back in 6 months, say, and then give me an update on that. If you notice that that's much more profound, there might be something to this. Because even though the memory loss from aging is really slow, if it was and dementia's like that, if you look at a graph over time, like dementia, you know, separates out, if we rewind that, there's a point where those two things are kind of similar. So time tells us if they kind of are going to separate out like that. So that's why I'll tell people, let's check back in 6 months. And if in 6 months they say, the guy says, it's the same, but it drives me crazy, you know, can you fix this? You know, I'll tell them, no, this is just natural aging related memory loss. Don't worry, you're not getting Alzheimer's disease. But if the guy's wife has to come in next time because he got lost driving home, you know, and stuff like that, then there's more to it. So memory loss and dementia is you know, pretty big problem for people as they get into their 70s and 80s.
That is true, and in my own life, I've noticed that, but I decided that as part of my exercise program, because I have to keep going back and forth so many times before I actually get what I was going there for.
Well, exercise is probably the number one thing people can do to help keep their brain healthy. You know, so let's say the person's worried they have, oh, doc, I'm getting Alzheimer's disease, I'm telling you. And then, you know, it turns out that they're just having some of that aging-related memory loss. They say, well, if I don't have Alzheimer's disease, what can I do? I say, well, you got to do everything that you can to keep your brain healthy. All right, how do I do that? Okay, quit smoking, right? Don't drink alcohol so much. And do things that enhance your brain's health by like physical activity. When you exercise, you increase blood flow through your brain, you know, and that's good for it. So, you know, those are things people can do to help keep their brain healthy. And physical activity and exercise is probably a huge one.
Okay. So my other question is, at one time, the only way you could get a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is to be dead and on the table where they could look at your brain. Is that still the case?
Well, you could, a neurologist can diagnose Alzheimer's disease through a combination of tests, you know, where you do pictures of the brain, and then you do mental testing. So to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, you start by, you know, doing blood tests, and you do pictures of the brain, and you make sure it's not like vascular dementia and that kind of stuff. Then you do cognitive testing, where the person, the doctor will say, they test your thinking. They'll say, I'm going to give you 3 objects to remember. And they'll say, you know, pen, glasses, watch. Okay, pen, glasses, watch, got it. And I'm going to ask you those. I know, I got it. And then, you know, you keep going with, you know, the stuff, and then you go back again, maybe like 10 minutes later, say, okay, now those 3 things I asked you, what were they? And the person will say, okay, glasses, yeah. All right, don't tell me. And all I remember is the glasses part. Okay, and then you score it. And then you ask them questions like, proverbs are one that are big. Like if I say, look before you leap, what does that mean to you? And the person will say, well, you gotta look where you're gonna jump so you don't go in a hole. Okay. And if the person, you know, that's a very concrete explanation of that proverb, right? And so if the person says, well, it means that, you know, you have to kind of like examine what you're going to do so that you don't make a mistake and get yourself in trouble. Okay, so that's a higher level answer, right? So that person's, you know, functioning at a higher mental level because they're giving you a more nuanced explanation of what that proverb means. So, and then doing things like, you know, a clock. You've seen like mental status, you know, like mini mental status exam and stuff that we give people. We'll say, you know, draw a clock that has 10 o'clock as the time. And so it's just a blank, and they have to draw the hands, you know, for 10 o'clock. And spell the word world backwards. And serial sevens, where you say subtract 7 from 100, 93. Okay, now subtract 7 from that. Okay. 3, okay. And then subtract 7 from that. It gets harder, you know. So those are called serial sevens, where you subtract 7 from 100 and 7 from that and 7 from that. So those kinds of testing are what the person can do to see how is your brain functioning. And then you ask them, if you found a letter on the ground that was written out, it was addressed to somebody and it had a stamp on it, you know, what would you do with it? And then, well, I'd put it in a mailbox, and it goes to the person that's supposed to, must have dropped it or something. Or sometimes people start to give you weird, well, I'd find the person, you know, and I'd take it to them, whoever was addressed, you know what I mean? Or I don't know, they give you weird, you know, explanations for it. So those my point is that there's there's neurocognitive testing that you can do to try to flesh this out, and you score it for all their answers, and then you get a number, and then there's sort of like ranges of what that number should be, and if it's below certain points, then that's suggestive of Alzheimer's, diagnostic for Alzheimer's disease, or for dementia.
Okay, and then are insurance companies willing to pay for the brain scans, or do they just feel like you're 80 years old, you're losing your memory,
Well,
you don't care?
it has to be a reason.
I guess my question is, how willing are they to go all the way through to determine if somebody has Alzheimer's, as opposed to not doing all the tests and thinking that you should be content
Having a diagnosis.
not having a definitive diagnosis, you should, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Where I'm
And
trying to
as
go.
far as insurance companies covering it, like Medicare, for example, there has to be a code. So if the doctor orders a test, along with that test, there has to be a code or codes that are called ICD-10 codes that are the justification for doing that test, right? Like if I send you for a chest x-ray, we have to say, well, why is the person, because they're having a cough, they can't breathe, they have shortness of breath when they lie flat, they, whatever, coughing up blood, whatever, right? They have to have, there's a diagnostic code that accompanies the order for that. And then the person who does the chest x-ray will bill the insurance, and they'll include that code, which is the justification for doing it. So assuming that a person goes to a doctor or a neurologist and they're having memory loss, changes in cognitive functioning, the person who's ordering the CAT scan or the MRI scan or whatever should be including the right codes that'll pass the insurance company, scrutiny or definitions of what they'll cover that test for. Like if I just said, I want you to do an MRI scan, and the reason is she's just worried, about, or her mom had Alzheimer's disease, or something like that, that might not pass the insurance company's, criteria for the test. So assuming it's for the right reasons, the insurance companies will cover it in most cases.
Well, that's good to know. I just wasn't sure how willing they were to try to get to the bottom of a disease that there's no cure for at this point.
Yeah, and there's not a cure for Alzheimer's, but there's more treatments that might help delay its progression or slow it down.
And is that actually slowing the disease down, or is it slowing the expression of the disease down?
Well, that's a good question. I think it just would slow down the symptom of memory loss or decline in cognitive functioning.
Okay.
Is it still considered terminal?
Well, dementia leads to death once it gets really advanced, but kind of indirectly. So let's say someone develops Alzheimer's disease, and it progresses to the point where they don't know any of their family members around them. They don't know where they are. They can't even speak. They're just mute, completely, demented, bedridden, that kind of thing. Well, then they can start to succumb to other causes of death, like pneumonia because they're bedridden, or they'll aspirate, when they get food or water down into the lungs, those kind of things. So you wind up succumbing to secondary effects of dementia once it gets really bad.
Right. Thank you.
I think kidney disease and things like that, because you're not getting enough, a lot of times people don't get enough liquids.
Yeah, but it winds up being those kind of like secondary causes, or injury, falls, things like that. A problem for elderly people with a high mortality rate is fractures, like a hip fracture. So if you're 85 and you get a hip fracture, the mortality is like 40%.
Oh my gosh.
Not because of the fracture itself, but because all of the things that come along with that fracture. You have to have surgery, and then then you're sitting in bed recovering, and sometimes you never really physically get back to the level you were before, and it can wind up 3 months later, the person, passes away from whatever, pneumonia, from having been sitting in bed all that time, that kind of thing. So hip fractures have a very high rate of mortality associated with them.
Okay. I'm curious, going back to the testing for Alzheimer's, what do you get from the blood test? What information are you getting from that regarding
Well,
your-
maybe looking for other causes of dementia, like the thyroid. Sometimes the thyroid is like super out of whack. What are called autoimmune diseases. Those can affect the blood vessels of the body. Kidney failure, diabetes, those kind of things. Things that kind of explain why this person's not thinking right.
Okay.
So, but for dementia, for Alzheimer's disease, there's not a single test for that, right? There's like a pregnancy test, right? You put a drop, something, and then it develops into a plus sign or a negative sign, right? There's not like like an Alzheimer's test like that, where you get a positive or negative. So, your Alzheimer's test is positive, that kind of thing. So it's not really like that. It's a more, kind of sophisticated set of testing that has to take place.
Okay. Then the next question is, I have read that the blood-brain barrier is supposed to keep like anesthetics and all that stuff out of your brain, but just from anecdotal evidence, it seems like a lot of times when an older person goes into surgery, they're mentally pretty good before they go in, and then they'll have surgery and they never come back. So I also read an article that said that there is some evidence that the blood-brain barrier may not be as absolute as it was once thought.
Yeah, as you get older, it's not quite as, we've evolved, to keep our brain protected from infection and from external, toxins and that kind of stuff. So the blood that circulates through the brain, we have a natural kind of barrier to protect the brain from bad stuff that can be in the blood, right? And that can start to kind of break down as we age a little bit and make a person more prone to getting brain effects from a disease or an illness or something. And then sometimes secondary things can affect the brain as we have a medical condition like bypass surgery. They used to stop the heart and put you on a bypass machine to circulate the blood around your body so that they could work on the heart and sew the things that they have to sew into the heart to go around the areas where the arteries are blocked. But they found that there was a higher rate of people mentally not quite being the same if they were, older after the surgery than they were before. Something happened to them. They didn't have a full-on stroke, right? But it just weren't quite the same. They just weren't quite thinking, their brain wasn't firing on all cylinders after their bypass surgery. So what they do now is they do bypass surgeries with the heart still beating. It's harder because the heart's beating and the doctor's trying to work on it, right? And it's moving around. But we try to keep people off of those bypass, blood bypass machines for heart surgery because it mentally, people weren't quite the same. And part of that's probably because the circulation through the brain was affected. If the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, it can sometimes cause a little bit of injury if there's ischemia to the brain that takes place. So if a person's blood pressure dropped real low because they had a severe infection, or if they had surgery, sometimes those things can sometimes temporarily affect the circulation through the brain, and that can lead to permanent changes. Subtle, permanent changes, not like a full-on stroke where a person's like knocked out half their body, but just they're not quite the same afterwards. I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
That is what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. And part of that could be blood-brain barrier, not as effective as we age. And we get certain stuff like anesthetics or toxins or chemicals and infection and stuff like that. And part of that can be because the circulation through the brain was temporarily affected in some way.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak and, collaborating, with, your clients and the medical community is going to be a real good thing going forward. So thanks for your interest, and I'm looking forward to speaking anytime you like.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.